Hi designers, this video has been created for you to demonstrate how to draw an elevation for an interior design. An elevation is a scale drawing of a wall within a design. It'll show you, for example, how tall something is or how wide something is. And it can often give you a great idea on what the design will actually look like once it's fully in place. This can be helpful to the designer in making final decisions. It can also be helpful to the client in whether or not they like the final product. This is an example of an elevation. It is a portion of our classroom wall in C281. What the wall actually looks like is this. So you can see we drew in our door, we showed our bulletin board, that there's a cinder block wall in the center as well as a desk area. I will be creating this exact picture again in this video. To do so, I'll be using graph paper. I can use a ruler because for every 1 inch it's 1 foot, and sometimes that's easier because of the size of the drawing I'm doing. I also have the option of using the ruler on the edge of my stencil that we have in our classroom. This measures the number of squares, and sometimes that's more convenient. For this scale drawing, I'll be using the scale of 1 inch equals 1 foot. So for every 1 inch on my ruler, that's going to equal 1 foot of space within the room. So for example, if I was drawing a 5-foot space, it's 5 inches wide. Some things to be aware of with drawing a scale drawing is how that'll transfer to other sizes of squares, and be mindful that some pieces of your drawing will be smaller than 1 foot, so we need to know how many squares are equal to a certain number of inches. 4 squares in this drawing is going to equal 1 inch, and I can check that anytime I can see that 1, 2, 3, 4 squares equals 1 inch. For the purposes of this scale drawing, that's going to equal 1 foot, and 1 foot equals 12 inches. If you ever forget, it's right there on your ruler. For the purposes of this drawing, since we're using that scale, 3/4 of an inch will equal 3 squares. 1, 2, 3. Here's 3/4 of an inch. With my scale drawing, that's going to equal 3/4 of a foot. You can type that into your calculator. 3 divided by 4 is 0.75, and multiply that number by 12, the original number of inches in a foot. You'll get 9 inches. So 3 squares will equal 9 inches in this drawing. 2 squares equals 1/2 of an inch, which for this drawing equals 1/2 of a foot, which will be 6 inches. I can calculate that the same way. 1 divided by 2 is 0.5 in my calculator, times 12 is 6 inches. I also know that 12 divided by 2 is 6. 1 square in this all of this graph paper, be mindful if you're using graph paper at home, it might have a different size square that can change your drawing. 1 square on this graph paper that I'm providing to you in class is equal to 1/4 of an inch, which is 1/4 of a foot. I can do the same thing. 1 divided by 4 is 0.25 times 12 will give me the number of 3. So there are 3 inches in every 1 square. There will be times in this drawing that something is presented to me in inches instead of feet. So for example, many times it might say 2.5 feet, and I can use my ruler to go 1 feet, 2 feet, 1/2 a foot, and I know that I'm in the right position. However, there will be other times that it's presented to me in inches. To calculate the number of squares in inches, I'm going to take the inches in an item and divide it by 3, which is a number of inches in 1 square in this drawing. So for example, if an item has 36 inches, which is equal to 3 feet, 36 inches divided by 3 inches in 1 square of this drawing would be equal to 12 squares. So I would need to draw out 12 squares wide for that item. If you have any questions on that, you're welcome to replay this portion of the video or ask your instructor for additional assistance. Let's begin. The wall that I'm drawing today has a 9-foot ceiling, and I'm drawing a 10-foot wide portion. The original wall is 22 feet wide. My paper that I'm using today is 17 by 11 and could only accommodate a 17-foot space on this sheet of paper. So we're just going to draw a portion of it to get our practice in. Now, depending on what you're using, we need to go ahead and put in our 9-foot wall from floor to ceiling. I can do that one of two ways. I can line up my ruler to identify 9 inches, which would be 9 feet. Or I can calculate 9 times 4 squares, because there's 4 squares in every foot, and that would give me 36 squares. Both ways are correct. It just depends on what tool you're using. Because we're using feet right now, I'm going to go ahead and draw it in with my ruler because it goes a little bit faster. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my floor to ceiling. So again, this is 9 feet. I'm going to make a note to myself here. And you could write that maybe it's 36 squares so you remember. In your final draft, you would want to erase some of these annotations. But when you're first drawing, it's easy to forget what's going on. So I like to give myself some notes. I'm going to be drawing a 10-foot wall segment. So I'm going to go ahead and show 10 inches because 1 inch equals 1 foot. I can also calculate that on my stencil. I would take 10 times 4 because there's 4 squares in 1 foot in this drawing, and that would be 40 squares. To do the 40 squares on your stencil, you may have already noticed you only have 36 on there. So what I would do is I would line it up, draw out my 36, and then move my stencil over for the additional 4 squares that we need. There we go. So now I have the space that my drawing is going to take place in. Looking at the room, a lot of times I like to pick out major features of the room to draw first. For example, this door is an architectural feature. It's never going to go away. I'm going to go ahead and draw that in first. Prior to this video, I went in with a tape measure and I measured from the door frame to the door frame how wide the door is. And I also measured this space above the door because we can see that the door actually stops before it hits the ceiling. From my measurements, I found that the door is 3 feet wide. So I can take my ruler, identify 3 feet, and make a little tick mark. Now, if you're using a stencil, that would be 12 squares wide. 3 times 4 is 12. From my picture, I could see that the door goes all the way up to the ceiling. And I'm going to go ahead and do exactly that. Okay. From here, I'm going to pause the video and do some shading. The shading is because I do have a door frame that I need to show. My door frame is 3 inches from the top and on either side of the door. So I'm showing you here what's going to happen. I'm going to pause the video and I'll be back with you in just a moment as soon as I'm done shading. All right, and we're back. So you can see I went in and I shaded a full square thickness to represent the 3-inch door frame all around my door. I'm going to go ahead and show where the door actually begins. It begins 2 feet from the top. That's equal to 8 squares. The door itself is 7 feet tall. That's how I know there's 2 feet remaining because we have a 9-foot ceiling. Okay. A couple features I want to show in my door. My door does have a window that is 6 inches wide and 2 feet 3 inches long. So I'm going to go ahead and show 2 squares wide, and then there's 24 inches and 2 feet, so that would be 8 inches. And then I need one more square to show the additional 3 inches. I know it's a unique measurement, but that's what it is. Okay. I also want to show my doorknob. And then I need to show how the door actually opens. The hinges of this door are over here on the right hand side. So I just need to make some diagonal lines showing where the hinge is on the door, and that's how it's actually going to open. The next feature I'm going to go in and show in my drawing is that there's a cinder block wall, and then I'm going to show where the desk, the bulletin board, and the window are. From that point, we can go in and put some more details. This measurement of the cinder block wall is about 1 foot 9 inches. So I actually need 7 squares, or 1 inch and 3/4 of an inch. And I'm just going to go ahead and draw that out floor to ceiling, because according to my picture, the cinder block wall section goes all the way up to the ceiling. And now I'm going to go in and draw out where the desk is, where the bulletin board section is, and where that top window portion is. The desk is 30 inches tall. So I'm going to calculate 30 inches divided by 3. That would equal 10 squares high. I can also measure that by 2.5 feet on my ruler. Okay. And then this desk actually wraps around the entire length of the wall, so I can go all the way to the end of my picture. From here, the height of my bulletin board is 4 feet. That would be equal to 16 squares. So whether you're using a stencil or a ruler, you can kind of see that the ruler makes things a little easier if you're working with big feet numbers, because then you're just counting the inches. And now I have the general framework of my elevation. From here, I can start putting in a few additional details. For example, I have a leg of the desk that starts at about 3 feet in. So I can go ahead and draw that in. And I can start shading in the thickness of my desk, as well as the thickness of the desk leg. These are all additional features that start to help bring the picture to life. Another thing that really adds a lot is when you actually go in and color your elevation. I recommend outlining everything in your elevation in black marker first and then going in and coloring. But just to give you an example of some of the details you might show in your picture, here is one that's already closer to finished. You can see I went in and drew in my cinder blocks. I started to show where the fire alarm was or emergency button was. I shaded in my desk to show some depth. I have some details from the bulletin board and a little bit of detail on the wood grain. I even went through and made some X's because there is some cross hatching in the window. And one that's a little bit more finished would be this one. You can see that I started to put in my fire extinguisher. I drew in some computer monitors, some details from the bulletin board displays, my light switches, and things like that. The more detail you put into your drawing, the more visual it is for your students, so that they have, your clients, so that they have an even better picture of what the actual room is going to look like. I hope that this video helps you with the basics of how to draw an elevation. And please feel free to ask me any questions you have for how to make your elevation come to life.